Hello, my name is Dennis Draeger, and I am the Research Director for Shaping Tomorrow. Recently, we had a client in the private sector who asked us specifically for help at reviewing their sustainability tactics and improving their sustainability tactics. We also had another client in the private sector who asked us not to bother talking about climate change because there wasn't anything they could do about it. And so it's interesting to see these two perspectives from two different sides of society as well. Anyway, we had a few discussions, and number one, we were able to come up with some interesting innovations for the client in the private sector, and the conversation with the client in the public sector progressed in a very unexpected manner. And they came around to realizing that there were some things they could do about it, but more importantly, that it's part of our future, and so they're going to need to prepare for it. So we're going to take a look at climate change here today, especially in light of COP26. So first off, one of the reasons we're actually doing this is because the United Nations recently partnered with us for this World Watch. Now, this is a new purpose-built participatory website to track emissions progress on a weekly basis. We invite you to join this free collaborative service to make your voice heard and to invite others too. I will include the link to this website on the page where you're probably viewing this video. Now, we'll be communicating the results to our clients, including the United Nations, on a regular basis, and so you'll be able to see some of those communications as well. Now, before we go too far, let's take a quick look at what happened at COP26. So one of the positive things that happened is that we have agreed to revisit emissions cuttings plans next year to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Beyond which some of the worst effects of global warming will be experienced on the Earth. And one of the negatives, however, is that there are still some very big emission cuts that need to be made in order to make that limitation, in order to limit global warming to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there is no agreement in place to deliver on that limitation. One of the positives, though, also is first ever inclusion of a commitment to limit coal use. However, there was pretty much a free pass to rich countries to continue emitting. Another one of the positive aspects is that we've increased financial help for developed countries. However, there's no guarantee that that increased investment in poorer countries will be forthcoming. So there were some evasive words and some coal compromise, but the deal is showing some progress. However, the United Nations Secretary General has said that it is time to move into emergency mode, which kind of implies that there may be a time when there will be fewer compromises made. All right, so taking a look at some of the forecasts that have been auto-extracted by Shaping Tomorrow's system. Scientists have warned that keeping temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which the worst impacts of climate change will be felt, requires global emissions to be cut by 45% by 2030 and to zero overall by 2050. So it might be time for us to start setting some more aggressive goals. Now, looking at some of the financial impacts from climate change, up to 13.16% of overall portfolio value is at risk, a value loss of $10.7 trillion US from the impact of climate change. Also, climate change could wipe out 15% of Africa's gross domestic product by 2030, and climate change could directly cost the world economy nearly $8 trillion by 2050 due to drought, flooding, crop failure, and damaging infrastructure. Now, the top topics through the time period are climate, energy, change, nature, and materials. So COP26 was a big conversation about all aspects of climate change, But in a crisis, this must now be narrowed to the vital few to be tackled immediately, or very little will happen. So that has so far not been achieved. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its first major update in 8 years, showing that the world will warm 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040 without the urgent slashing of emissions. And on the last Friday of COP26, the UN chief said the meeting would probably not achieve its aims, and the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is on life support. With 70% of global CO2 emissions coming from urban areas, where 7 out of 10 people will live by 2050, the solution to the climate crisis requires bold climate action in cities. And so what you're seeing here is an idea of some of the industries that are the most affected by climate change and are affecting climate change in many ways. So by 2050, 2/3 of the global population will live in cities, where after buildings and transport, waste is often the 3rd largest source of climate change emissions. So companies need to, and organizations in general, need to be strongly considering how they handle their waste. Also, this radar chart shows those emitters with a vested interest in no change, and why the many lobbyists have been pushing for softer, longer time frame targets at COP26. So rather than focusing on everyone, we recommend exerting maximum pressure on the top emitters. And this chart, the chart above, shows the trend line in the proportion of forecasts regarding this topic over the last 5 years. So you'll notice here that the interest kind of waned immediately, but it has steadily increased and increased dramatically in the lead up to COP26. So there's a great deal of interest in climate change at the moment, at least as far as the forecast that Shaping Tomorrow is extracting at the moment. Now let's take a look at a SWOT analysis for climate change at the moment. So the strength, the transition to low carbon has become a defining force for business. The weakness, areas of the world with weak health infrastructure that already struggle to provide adequate health care services will experience even greater strains on resources with climate change. And obviously this could lead to some health conditions that could become global concerns, just like COVID-19. An opportunity. In a race to tackle climate change, dozens of the world's biggest economies have adopted targets for net zero emissions by 2050 and are cutting fossil fuels and boosting clean energies. And a threat, without a fundamental change in direction, climate change will be irreversible, inflicting disastrous effects on the planet and humanity well before the convention reaches its 60th anniversary. Now let's take a look at a few questions regarding climate change. So clearer plans and pathways need to be drawn. What does the future of climate finance look like, and how can it be accessed? How can macroeconomic research more fully take into account the economic, social, and environmental benefits and costs of addressing the consequences and risks of climate change? How are climate change and other environmental factors affecting human capital development? And are there differences across groups? Also, what political logics and strategies can together act to erode capitalism and so the cause of climate change? Now, regardless of how you feel about capitalism, I'm rather fond of it myself, but the point is that there is a great deal of anti-capitalism sentiment at the moment, and largely because of its effects on climate change. So it's very important to be aware of that and aware of how that might actually be playing out at the moment, how it may play out in the future. Well, thank you very much for your time today. That concludes the presentation on the future of climate change. You have a great day. Bye-bye.